I was manipulated and everyone underestimated me, until I found courage and transformed my life. I never imagined that learning to say no would be one of the greatest challenges of my life. I grew up believing that being kind and helpful was the most beautiful way to exist in the world, and for many years I held this principle as an unquestionable value. I've always been the person who was willing to help, who would sacrifice something personal to avoid upsetting others. When I started my first job, this characteristic became even more evident. I was seen as the jack-of-all-trades employee, the one who volunteered without a second thought, who accepted extra tasks without question, and who did everything to avoid friction. This made me feel accepted and recognized. But deep down, I slowly realized something was wrong. It was as if I were fading away a little more each day, giving up my voice to maintain the peace of others. I felt trapped in an invisible trap, a routine in which I always gave in to avoid causing discomfort. And deep down, I was afraid. Afraid of being rejected, of being misunderstood, or even of being considered selfish if I dared to set my own boundaries. It was in this context that I met Rafaela. At first, she seemed like just another coworker, friendly and full of stories to tell. At first, I suspected nothing. She always talked about personal difficulties, mentioned financial issues, and even cried at times during conversations. I, with a soft, oh, heart, believed every word and leaned even closer to support her. It seemed natural to offer to help. After all, I already did it with everyone. But, unlike others, Rafaela didn't show genuine gratitude. She seemed to expect others to do things for her, as if it were an obligation. I noticed this first in small details. A coffee she forgot to pay for, a snack she claimed she didn't have enough money to buy, and someone in the group always ended up covering the bill. I myself was the first to do this, without much thought. It was just a coffee, nothing major. But as the months passed, the pattern became impossible to ignore. These weren't isolated incidents. It was a silent strategy to take advantage of others. The situation intensified when company social events became more frequent. Team dinners, colleagues' birthdays, and small celebrations became fertile ground for Rafaela to repeat the same behavior. The excuse was almost always the same. I forgot my wallet. The transfer didn't go through. The card didn't work. And invariably someone, often me, ended up paying her share. At first I tried to justify it internally. I thought maybe she was really struggling and that one day she would return the money. But that day never came. The unease grew within me, but along with it, the old voice telling me not to create conflict, not to spoil the mood. I smiled and let it go, but increasingly I felt myself being pushed into the role of an accomplice to an injustice. It wasn't just me. I saw my colleagues like Lucas, Zoe, Miguel, and Amanda starting to get annoyed too, but no one said anything. The collective silence was deafening, and I felt like I was part of a theater in which we all pretended not to see the abuse happening before us. That's when I realized the issue wasn't about money anymore, but about boundaries. I began to see myself reflected in that situation and realized how much my entire life had been marked by the difficulty of saying enough. I found myself repeating patterns, as if I were incapable of protecting myself or those around me. This realization hit me painfully. I asked myself, how long will I allow people to abuse my goodwill? How long will I tolerate unfair situations just to avoid a momentary friction? This reflection didn't come overnight. It was a slow process, filled with sleepless nights, during which I replayed the events in my mind and felt frustrated at not having reacted. At the same time, I realized I wasn't alone in this anguish. The looks on my colleagues' faces during the events spoke volumes. Everyone was tired, but everyone was afraid to confront Rafaela. The fear of confrontation held us hostage, as if it were easier to pay than to face the truth. It was at this point that I began to gather the strength to change. My name is Nicole. I was 29 at the time, and I was searching for stability in my life. I had been working at the same company for a few years, trying to build a solid career, and dreamed of earning my place fairly. Outside of work, I led a quiet life, living alone in a small apartment and cultivating friendships that brought me joy. But internally, I carried a silent struggle, the difficulty of positioning myself and the feeling that I lived to please others. Looking back, I realized that Rafaela was the trigger that exposed an old wound. She simply took advantage of the space I offered, repeating the dynamic I already had with so many others. But it was through this. experience that I finally realized that my kindness didn't need to be confused with submission, and that continuing to allow that exploitation meant betraying myself. After so many uncomfortable situations, I realized I couldn't fool myself anymore. Something had to change. I could no longer relax in team meetings because I kept waiting for Rafaela to come up with another excuse to escape her responsibility. I watched my colleagues try to hide their irritation, some exchanging glances, but everyone remained silent. And inside me, the weight grew. I felt like I was carrying the guilt of doing nothing, as if my silence were as damaging as her behavior. I often came home after these dinners with a lump in my throat, wondering why I didn't have the courage to speak my mind. The truth is, I was afraid of being seen as the annoying one, the troublemaker. This fear paralyzed me, but at the same time, it was suffocating. With each passing day, I felt smaller, as if I were shrinking into myself to fit into others' expectations. It was during one of those sleepless nights that I decided to observe everything more closely. If Rafaela was truly acting consciously, I needed to be sure. So I began recording the situations. Messages in which she requested loans that she never returned, photos of bills where her name appeared as the customer, receipts that showed the repetitive pattern of not paying. At first I felt strange doing this, as if it were something wrong. But at why? The same time, I realized I was simply gathering evidence of what was already evident. This wasn't imagination, nor was it an exaggeration on my part. It was real, concrete. With each new recording, my indignation grew, but along with it, something else was born, a seed of courage. For the first time, I saw myself not just as a victim, but as someone who could take action. Still, the internal struggle was immense. I would experience anxiety attacks just thinking about confronting Rafaela. My body reacted as if facing a life or death threat. Sweaty palms, racing heart, shortness of breath. I imagined all the possible consequences. What if she said no? What if my colleagues didn't support me? What if I was seen as exaggerated or malicious? These questions tormented me, and I often considered giving up. I told myself, let it go, it's not worth it. But at the same time, an inner voice responded, if you don't do something now, you'll never be able to defend yourself again. This internal conflict was perhaps the most difficult of the entire process, because it wasn't just Rafaela I had to face. It was my own insecurity, my tendency to keep quiet so as not to upset anyone. There was one specific moment when I almost gave up completely. It was during a team lunch when Rafaela again avoided paying, claiming she didn't have internet access to make the transfer. Everyone gave that awkward smile, and Lucas ended up taking over the bill. I kept quiet, but inside I was in pieces. I returned home devastated, crying as if I'd lost a personal battle. I seriously considered deleting all the messages and records, pretending nothing had happened, and moving on. It's just money, I repeated to myself, trying to convince my heart. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just about money. It was about respect, about dignity, about not allowing others to walk all over me without consequence. This certainty kept me going, even on days when the urge to give up seemed stronger than any courage. It was at this point of near give up that something inside me awakened. I remembered a phrase my mother had said when I was a child. Those who don't take a stand are positioned by others. These words echoed in my mind like a call. I realized that if I remained silent, I would not only be allowing Rafaela to exploit me, but also teaching others that it was acceptable to do so to me. I no longer wanted this role. I didn't want to be seen as the weak, voiceless person. So I made the definitive decision. I would confront her. It wouldn't be easy, I knew, but there was no turning back. I had proof, I was aware, and most importantly, I had a deep desire to change the way I treated myself. Courage still trembled within me, but for the first time, it was greater than fear. The day of the confrontation arrived almost without me planning it. It was a team dinner, something simple, just to celebrate the completion of an important project. I'd been nervous since morning, feeling my stomach churn as if I sensed what was coming. Throughout the workday, I mentally reviewed what I would do. I took deep breaths, remembered the evidence saved on my phone, and tried to control my fear. When we sat at the table, I tried to enjoy the moment, but deep down, I knew my attention was focused on Rafaela's behavior. And, as always, she repeated the script. When the bill arrived, she made that rehearsed gesture of searching for something in her purse, sighed with embarrassment, and blurted out, "Oh guys, I forgot my wallet. Can someone cover it for me? The silence that followed was heavy, but this time I didn't lower my head. My heart felt like it was going to leap out of my throat, but I took a deep breath and said firmly, "Rafaela, this isn't a coincidence. It's a pattern, and everyone here has noticed." The group froze. I felt the eyes on me, some in surprise, others in silent support. Rafaela tried to laugh, feigning casualness, but I continued. "I have messages, receipts, photos. This isn't an occasional oversight, it's a choice. You're exploiting our goodwill." There was a moment of absolute silence, and I was surprised that I'd managed to speak so clearly. It was as if each word had been bottled up inside me for months, waiting for the right moment to come out. I trembled inside, but outwardly, I held my ground. For the first time, I didn't flinch in the face of discomfort. Rafaela tried to react. She said I was exaggerating, that I was making things up. But before she could continue, I showed her some messages on my phone. The evidence was there, clear and indisputable. I'd never seen her face so disconcerted. She stammered, tried to justify herself, but the mask slipped. It was at that moment that I felt a shift in the air. My colleagues, who had previously been trapped in silence, began to speak out as well. Lucas confirmed situations in which he had paid for her. Zoe said she'd also been through the same thing. Miguel and Amanda nodded in agreement. It was as if my act of courage had given everyone permission to release the indignation they'd been pent up. And suddenly, the weight was no longer on me alone. The confrontation was harsh. Rafaela cried, saying it wasn't her intention, that she was going through difficulties. I listened, but this time I didn't let myself be manipulated. I responded firmly, but without aggression. If you're struggling, you should be honest and seek help elsewhere. It's unfair to use others as a permanent solution to your problems. I was surprised by my own stance. It wasn't anger I felt. It was a new clarity, a strength that seemed to have always been within me, but which I had never allowed to emerge. And deep down, I realized that this moment wasn't just about Rafaela. It was about me, about Nicole, who was finally allowing herself to take her own space and stand up for what she believed in. When the night ended, Rafaela left without looking back, clearly shaken. The group remained, together for a few more minutes, silent, processing what had happened. And then, something unexpected happened. My colleagues began thanking me. Lucas said I had done what everyone had wanted to do for a long time. Zoe hugged me, saying she felt relieved. Miguel commented that I had been brave, and Amanda said she had never seen anyone stand up to Rafaela like that. Hearing that was like a huge weight lifted off my shoulders. For the first time in a long time, I felt I wasn't alone. I discovered that courage is contagious, that an act of determination can liberate not only the person who performs it, but everyone around them. And as I said goodbye that night, I knew something inside me had changed forever. The morning after the confrontation, I woke with a mixture of fear and relief. The fear stemmed from uncertainty about the consequences. Would Rafaela spread rumors about me? Would the company view me as someone who caused conflict? But at the same time, there was a profound relief, as if a huge weight had been lifted from my chest. As I sipped my coffee, I noticed my body felt lighter, my breathing calmer. For the first time in months, I looked in the mirror and saw someone who wasn't hiding. There was insecurity, yes, but there was also pride. I had done what I'd always feared. I faced the situation, even though I was shaking inside, and I survived. More than that, I emerged stronger. At work, the following days were surprising. I expected suspicious looks or snide comments, but the opposite happened. Several colleagues approached me privately to thank me again. Some said they felt more motivated to assert themselves in similar situations. Others confessed that they also had difficulty saying no, and that my attitude inspired them to reflect on their own limits. I wasn't expecting this effect. I'd always seen myself as invisible, doing everything to avoid attention, and suddenly I was being seen as an example of courage. It was strange, but at the same time, transformative. I realized that by protecting myself, I had also protected others and shown that it was possible to face unfair situations with determination. Internally, the process of change was even more intense. I began to question other areas of my life where I was allowing myself to be used or diminished. I began to pay attention to how I accepted extra tasks without recognition, how I often said yes for fear of displeasing, how I avoided expressing strong opinions to avoid being judged. It was as if the episode with Rafaela had opened a window that illuminated all the hidden corners of my life. And in each of them, I saw the same root: the fear of not being accepted. This recognition was painful, but also liberating. I finally realized what needed to change. With this new understanding, I began testing myself in small, everyday situations. When a colleague tried to assign me a task that wasn't my responsibility, I took a deep breath and said, "Sorry, but that's not part of my scope. You need to speak to the person directly responsible." In the past, I would have taken the job without question, but this time I didn't. And to my surprise, all hell broke loose. The person simply accepted and moved on. This episode taught me that many of the monsters I imagined existed only in my head. The fear of confrontation was far greater than the confrontation itself. This discovery was one of the greatest victories I could achieve. At the same time, I began taking better care of myself. I started writing in a journal, recording my victories, no matter how small. I went to therapy, where I understood where this need to please everyone came from and how it was linked to my childhood. I discovered that for a long time, I had confused love with approval, which was why I had such difficulty asserting myself. With each session, I grew stronger. I realized that learning to say no wasn't an act of selfishness, but rather of self-love. It was recognizing my worth, respecting my limits, and allowing others to respect me too. And the more I practiced this, the freer I felt. Over time, I realized that my life had changed in ways I hadn't expected. It wasn't just the work environment that had transformed. I was different too. I began to feel more confident in my decisions, better able to deal with difficult people and challenging situations. I learned that kindness doesn't mean submission, and that assertiveness doesn't mean aggression. This internal change directly reflected in my routine. I became more organized, more present in important decisions, and more aware of my worth. My colleagues began to seek me out not only for friendship, but also for guidance. And this made me realize that leading by example, without imposition, was possible and effective. Another important lesson I learned was about courage. I'd always imagined courage as grand, heroic gestures, but I discovered it also manifests itself in small, everyday acts. Simply standing up for Rafaela, protecting my colleagues, and respecting my own limits was a constant exercise in courage. And each time I repeated this behavior, my self-confidence grew stronger. I began to realize that facing difficult situations isn't about not feeling fear, but about acting despite it. This understanding brought me a sense of freedom I'd never experienced before. My relationship with my colleagues improved significantly. Mutual respect increased, and the work environment became healthier and more collaborative. Rafaela, on the other hand, ended up stepping away naturally, and this didn't bring resentment, only relief. I learned that setting clear boundaries doesn't have to be aggressive. It just needs to be honest and firm. This experience also showed me the importance of supporting others, but consciously, without allowing them to be exploited. The feeling of having protected loved ones and taught by example is something that will stay with me forever. Looking back today, I see that this experience was transformative on several levels. Not only did I learn to deal with manipulation, but I also understood a lot about myself, my values, and my limits. I learned to identify toxic patterns, to trust my intuition, and to not feel guilty about putting my well-being first. I feel I've grown emotionally, spiritually, and socially. I discovered that it's possible to face challenges with dignity and intelligence, without sacrificing kindness, but also without allowing abuse. Each small victory added up to create a significant transformation, which continues to expand in my life. Sharing my story with you is an act of courage and reflection. I want you to know that even when it seems impossible, it is possible to protect yourself, assert yourself, and create a healthy environment around you. There is no magic formula for dealing with manipulation or abuse, but there are ways to strengthen yourself and learn from each experience. Today I feel more whole, more aware, and stronger. I know there are still challenges, but I am confident that I can face them with intelligence, determination, and dignity. The most important thing I've learned is that our strength lies within us, just waiting for us to have the courage to use it. This is my story of overcoming, transformation, and discovering my own worth.